"You should have let it burn," he said the first time I stood in his house, like saving a life had been a mistake, and maybe he was right, because everything that came after that night felt like stepping deeper into a fire I couldn't see. But that wasn't how it started. It started with smoke, thin at first, curling through the wooden beams of a barn that wasn't mine, on land I only worked because rent didn't wait and neither did hunger. And I remember thinking it smelled wrong, not like hay or dust or anything natural, more like gasoline soaked into old wood, and the horses knew it before any of us did. They always do, their restless hooves pounding against the stalls, sharp, frantic, like they were trying to warn us in a language we refused to understand. I dropped the bucket I was carrying, water sloshing over my boots, cold seeping through worn leather as I looked up and saw the first flicker. Orange against the dark rafters, small enough to ignore if you wanted to be stupid, big enough to know better, and then someone shouted, a man from the far end yelling for everyone to get out, his voice cracking like the wood already beginning to strain under heat, and suddenly everything moved too fast, people running, doors slamming, chains rattling as they tried to free the horses closest to the exit, the air thickening with smoke that burned my throat before I even took a full breath. I should have followed them. That's what every instinct screamed, get out, stay safe, don't be the girl who makes a bad situation worse. But then I heard it, softer than the chaos, a broken sound tucked behind the louder panic, a weak, uneven whinny that didn't belong to the strong animals pushing toward the open doors, and I turned, even though I knew I shouldn't, even though my chest already felt tight from the smoke, and I saw the far stall, half hidden in shadow, where the smallest shape struggled against a door that wouldn't budge. It was just a foal, too young, too slow, legs too unsteady to fight what was coming, and for a second I froze, because choosing to go back meant choosing the fire, choosing the risk, choosing something that didn't make sense when you looked at it from the outside, but sense had never paid my bills or kept me warm at night, and something in me refused to walk away from a life that couldn't save itself. The flames climbed faster then, licking across the ceiling, dropping sparks that stung when they hit my arms, and the heat pressed in like a wall I had to push through, every step harder than the last as I pulled my shirt over my mouth and ran toward the stall, my boots slipping slightly on scattered straw. The sound of cracking wood echoing above me, a warning I ignored because the foal was still there, still trying, still trapped. I grabbed the latch, yanked once, twice, nothing, it wouldn't move, and frustration flared hotter than the fire as I looked around for anything that could break it open, my hands shaking, my lungs burning, and for the first time I thought I might not make it back out, that this was where the line ended for me, in a place that didn't even belong to me. For a creature that wasn't mine, but the thought passed as quickly as it came because the foal stumbled, its small body hitting the wooden barrier, and something in my chest snapped into place. I didn't think after that, I just acted, gripping the metal latch with both hands and pulling with everything I had, ignoring the heat biting into my skin, ignoring the way the world narrowed to breath and movement and the fragile life on the other side of that door, because in that moment, nothing else mattered, not the fire, not the risk, not the fact that I had no idea whose animal this was or what it was worth, only that it was alive, and I wasn't the kind of person who walked away from that. I felt something give before I heard it, a sharp metallic snap under my grip that sent the latch jerking loose in my hands, and for half a second I just stared at it like I could not believe brute force had actually worked, but then the door swung inward and the foal stumbled forward into me, its body trembling, heat radiating off its coat as if it had absorbed the fire itself. An instinct took over again as I wrapped my arms around its neck, trying to steady both of us while the smoke thickened so fast it turned the air into something I had to fight just to breathe. "Come on," I whispered, even though I knew it could not understand me, my voice rough and uneven as I tugged gently, guiding it toward the only exit that still glowed with open space instead of flames, but every step felt slower now, heavier, like the world was pushing back against us, and the foal's legs buckled once, twice, nearly dragging me down with it as debris cracked somewhere above, a low groan that vibrated through the walls and into my bones. I did not look up, I could not afford to, because looking up meant thinking, and thinking meant hesitation, so I focused on the ground in front of me, on the rhythm of moving forward, one step, then another, pulling, coaxing, refusing to stop even when my lungs screamed and my eyes watered so badly everything blurred into shifting orange and gray. The heat pressed harder the closer we got to the center aisle, like walking into an open oven, and I could feel it through my clothes now, sharp and relentless, turning every second into a countdown I could not see but knew was there, and for the first time a flicker of doubt slipped in, quiet but dangerous, asking what would happen if I did not make it out, if this was where everything ended, but I pushed it away the same way I pushed through the smoke, because stopping was not an option anymore. Not with the Foal leaning into me like I was the only thing keeping it upright. We were halfway there when a beam shifted above us, the sound loud enough to make the Foal jerk in panic, its body pressing harder against mine as it tried to bolt in the wrong direction, and I tightened my grip, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break through my ribs. No, no, this way, I said, forcing calm into words I did not feel, guiding its head back toward the light that flickered through the open doors. Closer now. So close I could almost feel the cooler air waiting on the other side. My boots hit the threshold and I did not slow down. I could not. I just kept moving until we were both clear of the barn, until the heat dropped from unbearable to sharp and distant, until the noise shifted from enclosed chaos to open air filled with shouting voices and pounding footsteps, and only then did my legs finally give out, dropping me to my knees as the Foal collapsed beside me, both of us shaking, both of us breathing like we had outrun something we could not fully understand. Hands reached for me then, pulling me back, voices asking if I was okay, if I was hurt. But they sounded far away, like they were coming from the other side of a wall, and I barely registered them because my focus stayed on the Foal, on the way it lifted its head slightly, still alive, still here, and a strange sense of relief settled over me, quiet but steady, like I had done what I came back to do. I might have stayed there longer, caught between exhaustion and disbelief, if not for the sudden shift in the air, the kind that does not come from fire or wind but from something else entirely. Something controlled, deliberate, and when the sound of engines rolled in low and powerful, cutting through the chaos like it belonged there, I knew without anyone saying a word that whoever owned this place had just arrived, and somehow, deep down, I knew that walking into that fire had not been the most dangerous decision I had made that night. The engines did not roar, they settled, low and controlled, like something powerful choosing not to be loud, and every voice around me shifted without being told, conversations cutting off mid-sentence, movement slowing, attention turning in the same direction as if pulled by an invisible thread, and I felt it before I saw him, that strange pressure in the air that made everything else feel smaller, quieter, less important. I pushed myself up slightly from the ground, my hands still shaking. My chest rising and falling too fast as I tried to catch my breath, and through the haze of smoke and flashing emergency lights I saw the line of black vehicles stop just short of the barn, doors opening in unison, men stepping out in dark suits that did not belong anywhere near dirt or fire, but somehow made the entire scene feel like it belonged to them instead. They moved quickly but not chaotically. Scanning, assessing, taking control without raising their voices, and then he stepped out last, not in a rush, not reacting, just arriving, like everything had been waiting for him to get there. He was taller than I expected, broad-shouldered without looking bulky, his posture straight in a way that felt deliberate rather than stiff, dark hair pushed back neatly despite the night air. And even from where I knelt I could tell he was not looking at the fire first, he was looking at everything else, the people, the damage, the details that mattered more than the obvious, and when his gaze finally shifted, it landed exactly where I did not expect it to, on me. It was not curiosity, not concern, not even surprise, it was something sharper, something that felt like being measured and understood in the same second, and I held that look longer than I should have, too tired to look away, too stubborn to drop my gaze first, until one of the men beside him leaned in and said something low enough that I could not hear, and only then did he move again, walking toward us with a calm that did not match the chaos still crackling behind him. Someone helped me to my feet as he approached, their grip careful but firm, and I realized how unsteady I was, how the world tilted slightly when I stood too fast. But I forced myself to stay upright because something about him made me feel like falling apart in front of him would be a mistake I could not take back. He stopped a few feet away, close enough now that I could see the details, the clean lines of his suit untouched by ash, the faint crease between his brows, the kind that came from thinking too much rather than reacting too quickly, and then his eyes shifted past me to the Foal, still lying on the ground but breathing, alive, its sides rising and falling in uneven rhythm, and for the first time something changed in his expression, subtle, almost invisible, but there. A flicker that told me this animal mattered more than anything else on this property. Who did that? He asked, his voice low, controlled, not loud enough to demand attention but strong enough that everyone heard it anyway, and for a second no one answered, the silence stretching just long enough to feel intentional, until someone behind me spoke up, pointing in my direction, their words tumbling over each other as they explained what had happened, how I had gone back in, how I had pulled the foal out when no one else would. I felt every pair of eyes shift to me then, the weight of it uncomfortable in a way I could not explain, but his gaze did not change, it stayed steady, focused, as if he was still trying to understand something that was not obvious on the surface, and when he stepped closer, closing the distance between us, I realized this was the moment everything shifted, not because of the fire, not because of what I had done, but because of who was standing in front of me now. You went back inside, he said, not a question, just a statement of fact, and I swallowed, my throat still raw from the smoke, forcing my voice to stay even as I answered. It was going to die, simple, direct, the only truth that mattered to me in that moment, and something in his eyes sharpened at that, not softer, not kinder, just more focused, like I had given him an answer he had not expected but could not ignore, and when he finally spoke again, quieter this time, almost to himself, it carried a weight I did not understand yet. You risked your life, for something that belongs to me, and I should have stepped back, should have created distance, but I did not, because something in the way he said it made it clear this was not about gratitude, not about kindness, it was about ownership, and somehow, standing there under his gaze, I had the unsettling feeling that the fire had not taken anything from me, it had handed me over instead. I did not like the way he said that, not the words themselves but the weight behind them, like the foal was not just an animal but a piece of something larger, something controlled, and I forced myself to hold his gaze even as my fingers curled slightly at my sides, grounding myself in the fact that I had walked into that fire on my own terms, not his. It does not belong to me, I said, my voice rough but steady, and for a second the space between us shifted, subtle but real, like I had stepped somewhere unexpected and he had noticed, really noticed, not just the act but the reason behind it. The men around him went quiet in a different way now, more alert, like they were watching something they did not fully understand unfold, and I could feel their attention even without looking at them, but I did not break eye contact, because something in me refused to shrink under the weight of his presence. His expression did not harden, it did not soften either, it changed in a way that was harder to define, a slight tilt of his head, a narrowing of his eyes as if he was recalculating, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that same controlled calm but with a sharper edge beneath it. Everything on this land belongs to me, and there it was again, that word, belong, like a line drawn in the sand that I had unknowingly crossed. I could have apologized then, could have stepped back into something safer, something smaller, but the image of the foal struggling behind that locked stall flashed in my mind and pushed the words out before I could stop them. Then maybe you should have been here sooner, and the second the sentence left my mouth, the air changed, not louder, not dramatic, just tighter, like a string pulled too far. One of the men shifted beside him, barely noticeable, but enough to tell me I had said something I was not supposed to say. And for a heartbeat I wondered if I had gone too far, if this was where the consequences caught up to me. But Alexander Kane did not react the way I expected. He did not raise his voice, did not step closer in anger. He just looked at me, really looked this time, and something in that silence felt heavier than any response he could have given. Behind us, the fire crackled lower as hoses finally reached it, the chaos settling into controlled movement. But none of that seemed to matter in the space we stood in, because his focus did not leave me, not even for a second, and when he finally moved, it was not toward the barn or his men, it was toward the foal, kneeling slightly, one hand reaching out in a way that was careful, almost precise, checking its breathing, its condition, and I realized then that whatever else he was not careless about what was his. He stood again just as smoothly, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve, and when his gaze returned to me, it carried something new, not anger, not gratitude, something closer to interest, the kind that did not fade quickly. "What is your name?" he asked. And it was the first time he had asked me anything instead of stating it, and that difference mattered more than I expected. "Lily," I said after a brief pause, the word feeling smaller than it ever had before, and he repeated it once, quieter, like he was testing how it sounded. how it fit into whatever calculation was forming in his mind. "Lily," he echoed, and then there was a pause, just long enough for me to think the moment might end there. That I might be able to step away and return to a life where fires were accidents and not turning points, but then he spoke again, and this time there was no ambiguity in his tone, no room for misunderstanding. "You are not leaving," and it was not a command shouted across a room, it was quieter than that, more controlled, but somehow more absolute, and something cold settled in my chest as I realized he was not asking for my help, he was deciding my place, and for the first time since I had walked out of the fire, I understood that surviving it had only brought me into something far more dangerous. For a second I thought I had misheard him, that the exhaustion and smoke still clinging to my lungs had twisted his words into something they were not, but the way he stood there, completely still, completely certain, told me I had heard exactly what he meant, and something in me pushed back before I could stop it. "I am not staying," I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended, but I did not take them back, because if I gave him even an inch, I had the feeling he would take the rest. Without asking, and his gaze did not flicker at my response, did not show surprise or irritation, just that same steady focus like he had already accounted for my resistance before I spoke it. Around us, the movement picked up. Again, his men coordinating quietly, someone bringing a blanket for the Foal, another speaking into a phone with clipped, efficient words, but none of it pulled his attention away, not fully, not from me, and that alone told me more than anything else could have. "You ran into a burning structure," he said after a moment, his tone even, almost analytical, like he was listing facts instead of arguing. "You ignored instructions, ignored risk, and chose action over safety," and I frowned slightly. Not understanding why he was saying this like it was part of a report, not a conversation, until he added, quieter, "People like that do not walk away unnoticed," and something about the way he said people like that made my stomach tighten, because it sounded less like a compliment and more like a classification. "I did what anyone would have done," I replied, even though we both knew that was not true, because no one else had gone back. No one else had made that choice, and his expression shifted just enough to tell me he recognized the lie for what it was. "No," he said simply, "they would not," and the certainty in his voice left no room to argue, not because he was forcing the point, but because he believed it completely, and that belief carried weight I could not ignore. I glanced past him then, toward the edge of the property where my old truck sat parked, the paint faded, one headlight dimmer than the other. A reminder of the life I knew, simple, predictable, mine, and for a second I focused on that, on the idea of walking over, getting in, driving away before this moment could turn into something permanent, but when I shifted my weight like I might actually move, two of the men near the vehicles adjusted their positions slightly, not blocking me, not obviously, but enough to make the message clear without a single word being spoken, and a cold realization settled in my chest. I looked back at him slowly, meeting his eyes again, and this time there was no confusion left, only understanding, and something sharper beneath it, something that refused to bend even now. "You cannot just decide that for me," I said, quieter this time but no less firm, and for the first time, a hint of something almost like amusement touched the corner of his expression, gone as quickly as it appeared, but enough to tell me I had said something unexpected again. "I do not decide," he replied, and for a brief second I thought maybe I had been wrong, maybe I had misread everything, but then he finished, his voice low and steady, "I recognize." And the difference between those two words landed heavier than anything else he had said so far, because it meant this was not about control in the way I understood it, it was about something else entirely, something that saw me not as a stranger passing through, but as something that had already crossed into his world whether I wanted it or not. The night air felt cooler now, the fire finally under control behind us, but none of that eased the tension coiling tighter with every second, and when he took one small step closer, closing the distance just enough to make it impossible to pretend this was casual, I did not move back, not because I was unafraid, but because fear was not the strongest thing in me at that moment. "You said it did not belong to you," he continued, his gaze steady, unyielding, "but you still chose it," and I swallowed, my throat still raw, my pulse uneven but strong, and for the first time I realized this conversation was not about the fire, not about the Foal, not even about what I had done. It was about what that choice revealed, and why it mattered to someone like him. I held his gaze and answered the only way I could, honest and unfiltered. I chose what was right, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was full of something shifting, something locking into place in a way I could not see but could feel, and when he finally spoke again, it was softer, almost quiet enough to miss if you were not listening for it. Then you should understand why I am choosing now. And that was the moment I realized this was no longer about leaving or staying, it was about the fact that, without meaning to, I had just become part of a decision that was already made. The words settled between us like something final, not loud, not forced, just there, and I realized with a clarity that felt colder than the night air that this was not a conversation I could win by pushing harder, because he was not arguing with me, he was absorbing me, fitting what I said into something larger I could not see. I let out a slow breath, steadying myself, forcing my thoughts back into order because panic would not help me here, not with a man like this, and I shifted my weight again, more deliberately this time, testing the space around me, testing the boundaries that had quietly formed without permission. You do not know anything about me, I said, keeping my voice even, because if he was going to define me by one choice, then I needed to remind him that one moment did not equal a life, but his gaze did not waver, did not retreat, and if anything, it sharpened again like I had just given him something else to consider. I know enough, he replied, and there was no arrogance in it, no exaggeration, just a calm certainty that made it harder to dismiss. You saw risk and moved toward it, not away. You made a decision without waiting for approval, and you followed it through. He paused for a fraction of a second, his eyes holding mine in a way that made it impossible to look anywhere else. That tells me more than a history ever could, and I felt something tighten in my chest again, not fear exactly, something closer to frustration, because he was not entirely wrong, and that made it harder to argue. Behind him, the foal shifted slightly, a small, uneven movement that drew both of our attention for a moment, and one of his men stepped closer, checking it carefully, speaking in a low voice about calling a veterinarian, about ensuring it was stable, and I watched that interaction with a strange awareness, noticing how everything around him functioned with quiet precision, like every piece already knew its role. It needs water, I said before I could stop myself, my focus still on the foal, and it should not be moved too quickly. The words came automatically, habits formed from working around animals more than people, and for the first time since he arrived, Alexander did not respond immediately. Instead he glanced toward the man beside the foal, gave a small nod, and just like that, my suggestion became instruction, carried out without question. That should not have mattered, but it did, because it told me something about how this worked, about how quickly things shifted once he acknowledged something, and I felt the edges of my situation become clearer in a way that was both helpful and deeply unsettling. You are injured, he said then, his gaze dropping briefly to my hands, to the faint redness where the heat had reached through. Not severe, but noticeable, and I instinctively pulled them back slightly, more out of habit than pain. I am fine, I answered quickly, because admitting weakness felt like giving him something else to use, but he did not accept that, not directly. Instead he gestured slightly and one of the men moved forward with a small medical kit, stopping just short of me, waiting, not forcing, just present. I hesitated, the instinct to refuse rising again, but my hands stung with every movement now, and practicality won over pride as I nodded once, letting the man clean and wrap them with careful, efficient movements, and through it all, Alexander watched, not intruding, not speaking, just observing in that same focused way that made me feel like nothing about me was going unnoticed. When it was done, the man stepped back, and I flexed my fingers slightly, testing the tightness of the bandage, grounding myself again in something physical, something I understood, and when I looked up, Alexander was still there, still exactly where he had been, like he had not moved an inch since this began. You helped something that matters to me, he said quietly, and there was no softness in it, no warmth, just a statement that carried weight, that creates a connection, and I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because of how easily he reduced something complicated into something simple, something transactional. And I shook my head slightly, meeting his gaze again. That is not how this works, I said, but even as I said it, I knew that in his world, maybe it was exactly how things worked. He stepped closer then, not aggressively, not quickly, just enough to close the remaining distance so that his voice did not have to carry at all when he spoke again. It is now, and the quiet certainty in those 3 words settled into me deeper than anything else he had said, because for the first time, I understood that this was not about convincing me, it was about the fact that, whether I agreed or not, something had already changed, and walking away would not erase it, not for him, and maybe not for me either. I should have stepped back then, should have created distance before the moment settled into something harder to undo, but my feet stayed planted, my body still running on the same stubborn instinct that had carried me into the fire, and I realized that part of me was not just resisting him, it was trying to understand him, which felt like its own kind of risk. Connections go both ways, I said after a moment. My voice quieter now but steady, because if he was going to define what this was, then I needed to remind him it was not one-sided, and for the first time since he arrived, there was a pause that felt different, not calculated, not immediate, like I had shifted something just enough to make him consider it. His gaze held mine, searching, not for weakness but for something else, something I could not quite name, and when he spoke again, there was a subtle change in his tone, not softer, but less absolute. Most do not survive long enough to test that, and the way he said it was not a threat, not a warning, just a statement of fact that carried its own kind of weight. I exhaled slowly, letting that settle without reacting to it, because reacting would mean giving it power, and I was not ready to do that yet. Behind us, the activity continued to shift into order, the fire reduced to controlled steam and darkened wood, the chaos replaced by efficiency. And the foal had been carefully moved onto a clean blanket, its breathing steadier now, its small body no longer trembling as violently, and I found myself drawn to it again, stepping slightly to the side, kneeling just enough to check its condition without thinking about who was watching. It is going to be all right, I murmured, more to myself than anyone else, my hand hovering just above its neck before resting lightly, careful, gentle, and for a moment everything else faded, the tension, the presence behind me, the weight of whatever this situation had become, replaced by something simpler, something real. I almost forgot he was there until I felt it again, that quiet shift in the air that came whenever he moved, and I looked up to find him closer now, not intruding, not interrupting, just observing in that same focused way that made me feel like he saw more than I was showing. You speak to it like it understands, he said, and there was no judgment in his voice, just curiosity, controlled but genuine, and I shrugged slightly, my attention still on the foal as I answered, maybe it does, because in my experience, animals understood more than people gave them credit for, and they listened better too. He watched that interaction for a second longer, something unreadable passing through his expression, and then he shifted his attention back to me fully. You are not afraid, he said, and that caught me off guard, not because it was true, but because it was not entirely accurate. I let out a small breath, a hint of something almost like a dry laugh escaping before I could stop it. That is not true, I replied, finally looking at him again, meeting his gaze without hesitation. I am just not letting it decide for me, and the moment the words left my mouth, I knew they mattered, not just to me, but to him too, because something in his posture changed, subtle but undeniable, like he recognized that line, that way of thinking. Silence stretched between us again, but it was not empty, it was full of something shifting, something aligning in a way I did not fully understand yet, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more deliberate. That is exactly why you are not leaving, and there it was again, not a command, not raised, but certain, rooted in something deeper than control, something that made it harder to argue because it was not based on force, it was based on belief. I straightened slowly, rising back to my feet, the bandages on my hands pulling slightly as I moved, grounding me again in the reality of where I was, who I was standing in front of, and what this moment had become. And I realized then that this was not about convincing him to let me go, it was about understanding what he saw when he looked at me, and deciding whether I was going to fight it, or find a way to stand inside it without losing myself. You keep saying that, I said finally, my voice calm but firm, like it is already decided, and his gaze did not waver, did not soften, just held steady as he answered, it is, and something in the way he said it told me this was not the end of the conversation. It was the beginning of something I had not agreed to, but was already part of, whether I wanted to be or not. I let his words sit there between us, not because I agreed with them, but because reacting too quickly would mean stepping into a rhythm he already controlled, and I was starting to understand that everything about him worked that way, not force, not pressure, just certainty that bent everything else around it. I folded my arms lightly, more to steady myself than to challenge him, the bandage tightening slightly against my skin. A quiet reminder that this night was real, that I had walked into Fire and come out into something even harder to navigate. You do not even know what I want, I said, and this time there was no edge in my voice, just truth, because that mattered more than pushing back blindly, and for a moment, just a moment, his gaze shifted in a way that felt like recognition, like he understood that I was not arguing for the sake of it, I was holding on to something that was mine. Then tell me, he replied, and the simplicity of that caught me off guard, not because it was a question, but because it was the first time he had opened space instead of closing it. I hesitated, not because I did not know the answer, but because saying it out loud felt like placing it directly in front of him, something he could examine, evaluate, maybe even use, but I said it anyway, because anything less would not be honest. I want to leave here, get in my truck, and go back to a life where tonight is just a story I tell myself. To make sense of things, and as the words settled, I realized how small they sounded compared to everything surrounding us, how ordinary they were in a place that was anything but. He listened without interrupting, without reacting immediately, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more deliberate, and you think that life will still be there, and it was not a challenge, not a dismissal, it was something else, something closer to a question wrapped inside a statement, and I frowned slightly, because I had not expected that angle, not from him. It is my life, I said, more firmly this time, because that part one would not let go of, no matter what he saw or believed, and for a second, the silence stretched again, not tense, not heavy, just full of something shifting, something neither of us had fully defined yet. Behind him, one of his men approached, speaking quietly, something about the property, about the cause of the fire not being accidental, and I caught just enough of it to feel a flicker of unease settle deeper in my chest, because that changed things, not just for him, but for me too, whether I wanted it to or not. Alexander listened without turning, gave a small nod, and dismissed the man with a single look, like the information had already been processed, already filed into whatever system he used to understand the world, and then his attention returned to me fully, sharper now, more focused, as if that detail had just shifted the entire context of our conversation. You were inside, he said, and this time there was something different in his tone, not control, not curiosity, something closer to calculation. You saw things others did not, and I felt that unease grow, not because of what I had seen, but because of what that meant in his world, in his rules, in whatever lines had just been crossed without me realizing it. I saw a fire and a trapped animal, I replied, keeping my voice steady even as my pulse picked up again. Because admitting anything beyond that felt like stepping deeper into something I did not understand, and his gaze held mine, unblinking, like he was measuring the truth in what I said, not doubting it, but placing it in a larger picture I could not see. He took a step closer then, not enough to invade, just enough to make the space between us feel intentional, and when he spoke again, his voice was low, controlled, but carrying something new beneath it, something that made the air feel tighter. Then you are already part of it, and the words landed differently this time, heavier, more final, because they were no longer about choice or connection. They were about consequence, and for the first time since this began, I understood that leaving was not just something he was refusing to allow, it was something that might not even be possible anymore, not without stepping into risks I had not agreed to, not without becoming something I had never planned to be. And as I stood there under his gaze, the night quieter now, the fire reduced to smoke and memory, I realized that the real danger had never been the flames. It was the moment I chose to walk back into them, because that choice had followed me out, and it was not letting go. His words did not feel like a warning, they felt like a door closing behind me, quiet but permanent, and I stood there for a second longer than I should have, trying to understand where the line had been crossed, when something simple had turned into something I could not step back from. Part of what? I asked, because if he was going to pull me into something, then I needed to hear it clearly, not implied, not hidden behind his calm. And his gaze did not shift, did not soften, just held steady, like he had already decided how much I needed to know. Something that was not meant to be seen, he said, and there was no drama in it, no exaggeration, just a quiet statement that carried more weight than anything louder could have, and I felt that unease tighten again, sharper now, because I knew he was not talking about the fire anymore. I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to stay grounded, because reacting too quickly would only pull me deeper into his pace, his control, and I refused to lose myself that easily. Then maybe I did not see anything, I said, meeting his gaze directly, offering him an exit, a way to let this go. Without turning it into something bigger, but the moment the words left my mouth, I knew he would not take it, because men like him did not rely on maybes, they relied on certainty. A faint shift crossed his expression, not disbelief, not anger, something closer to acknowledgement, like he understood exactly what I was trying to do and respected it just enough to not dismiss it outright. You are not someone who ignores what you see, he replied, and that landed harder than it should have. Because it was not an accusation, it was an observation, one that felt uncomfortably accurate. I shook my head slightly, a quiet exhale leaving my lips as I looked away for just a second, gathering my thoughts before looking back at him again, because if this was going to continue, then I needed to stay clear, not reactive. I know when something is not mine to get involved in, I said, and that was true. At least it had been before tonight, before I made a choice that changed where I stood. He studied me for a moment, longer this time, like he was weighing not just my words but the intent behind them, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that same controlled calm, but there was something deeper beneath it now, something more deliberate. And yet you involved yourself, he said, not as a contradiction, but as a fact, and I did not answer immediately, because there was no easy response to that, no simple way to separate what I had done from what it had led to. Behind us, the last of the smoke drifted into the night, the property settling into an eerie quiet that made every word feel louder than it actually was, and I became aware again of how isolated this place felt, how far removed it was from the world I had planned to return to just hours ago. I am not part of whatever this is, I said finally, my voice steady but firm, because that line mattered, even if he did not see it the same way. And for a second, something in his expression shifted again, not disagreement, not acceptance, something more complex, like he was considering how much of that statement could still hold true. He stepped slightly to the side then, not away from me, just enough to change the angle, and I followed his gaze without thinking, my eyes landing on the darkened remains of the barn, the structure now reduced to shadow and smoke, and for the first time I noticed something I had not before, something small but out of place, a section near the back that had not burned the same way as the rest, the pattern uneven, like the fire had started there but moved differently than it should have. My chest tightened slightly as I processed that, as pieces I had not been paying attention to began to align in a way that made less sense the longer I looked, and before I could stop myself, I said quietly, almost to myself, that does not look right, and the moment the words left my mouth, I felt it again, that shift in the air, sharper this time, immediate, and when I looked back at him, his gaze was no longer just focused, it was locked, like I had just confirmed something he had already suspected. Neither of us spoke for a second, but the silence between us changed completely. No longer uncertain, no longer open, it felt sealed, like something had just been decided without either of us saying it out loud, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, quieter, but carrying a weight that settled deep. No, he said, his eyes never leaving mine, it does not, and that was the moment I understood that whatever I had just noticed, whatever I had just said, it had taken me from someone who was there by accident to someone who now knew something I was not supposed to, and standing there under his gaze, I realized that walking away was no longer just difficult, it might be impossible, not because he would not let me, but because I had just stepped into something that would not let me go. The moment he confirmed it, something inside me shifted from uncertainty into clarity, not comfort, not acceptance, but awareness, the kind that settles deep and refuses to be ignored, and I felt my pulse steady in a way that surprised me, like my mind had decided that if I was already in this, then fear was not going to help me understand it, so it was not an accident, I said, more to connect the pieces than to ask a question. And he did not respond immediately, but the silence itself felt like confirmation, like the absence of denial carried more truth than any explanation he could have given. I turned my gaze back toward the barn, studying the uneven burn again, the way one section looked darker, more contained, like something had started there and spread outward in a pattern that did not match the rest, and now that I had seen it, I could not unsee it, which meant he was right, I had stepped into something that was not meant for me. You already knew, I added, glancing back at him, because this was not new information for him, it was something he had been waiting to confirm, and that realization settled heavy, because it meant everything happening now was part of something already in motion. His expression did not change, but there was a quiet acknowledgement in his eyes that told me I was not wrong. I suspected, he said, his voice low, controlled. Now I know, and the difference between those two states felt like a line being crossed, one that pulled me further into whatever this was. I exhaled slowly, pressing my lips together for a second as I considered what that meant for me, not in theory, but in reality, standing here, seen, involved, unable to step back into ignorance. Then I should leave before I know anything else, I said, and this time it was not resistance, not defiance, it was logic, simple and direct. Because the less I knew, the less reason there would be for me to be part of it, and for a moment, I thought maybe he would agree, maybe he would see that as the cleanest solution, but the way his gaze held mine told me I had already passed that point. You noticed what others did not, he replied, and there was something different in his tone now, not just observation, something closer to decision, that does not happen twice by accident, and I felt that same tension return, sharper now, because I understood what he was implying, even if he was not saying it outright. You think this is something I do, I said, a hint of disbelief slipping into my voice, because the idea of being defined by one moment, one instinct, felt both too simple and too complicated at the same time, and for the first time, his answer came without pause, without hesitation. I think it is who you are, and that landed deeper than anything else he had said so far, not because it was flattering, not because it was threatening, but because it forced me to look at myself in a way I had not before. I looked away again, just for a second, grounding myself in the quiet of the night, the faint smell of smoke still lingering, the distant sound of movement as his men continued their work. And I realized that everything around me had settled except this, except the space between us that kept shifting with every word. Even if that were true, I said slowly, turning back to him, meeting his gaze again with something steadier now, something more deliberate, that does not mean I belong in whatever this is, and there it was again, that word, belong, but this time it came from me, and I saw the way it registered, the way his expression shifted almost imperceptibly as if I had just aligned something in his thinking without meaning to. He took a step closer then, not enough to close the space completely, just enough to make the distance intentional again, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but carried more weight, more certainty. It means you already are, and I felt something settle in my chest at that, not acceptance, not defeat, something else. Something that felt like standing at the edge of a choice I had not planned to make, because for the first time, I realized this was not just about him deciding, it was about whether I was going to keep fighting a situation that was already unfolding, or find a way to stand inside it without losing control of who I was. I held his gaze, steady now, no hesitation left, because if I was going to be pulled into this, then I was not going to disappear inside it. Then you are going to have to start telling me what that means, I said. And the silence that followed was not empty, it was charged, like something had just shifted again, not in his favor, not in mine, but into something new, something neither of us fully controlled anymore, and for the first time since this began, I saw it, just for a second, something in his eyes that looked less like certainty and more like interest, like this was no longer just about what I had done, but what I might do next. The moment I said it, something settled between us that had not been there before, not tension, not resistance, something closer to alignment, like I had stepped into the conversation instead of pushing against it, and I saw it in his expression, not a change, not softness, but a shift in focus, sharper, more deliberate, like he was no longer assessing whether I mattered, but how. He did not answer immediately, and I realized that silence was part of how he worked, not avoidance, not hesitation, but control, letting space do what words could not, and for the first time, I did not rush to fill it. I let it sit, steady, grounded in the fact that I had asked something real, something that required more than a simple response. Behind him, one of his men moved again, speaking quietly about securing the perimeter, about ensuring no one else had seen anything, and that word, securing, settled into my awareness with a weight that made everything clearer. This was not just about a fire, it was about something contained, something protected, something that did not leave room for loose ends. It means, he said finally, his voice low, measured, drawing my attention back to him completely, that you are now aware of a situation that does not allow for uncertainty, and the phrasing was careful, precise, not revealing more than necessary, but enough to confirm what I had already begun to understand. I held his gaze, not interrupting, because I could tell he was choosing his words deliberately, and that mattered, not just what he said, but what he did not. It means that what you saw, what you noticed, connects you to something that is already in motion, he continued, and I felt that same quiet weight settle deeper, because motion meant this was not over, not contained to tonight, not something that would fade when the smoke cleared. I folded my arms again, more out of habit than defense, grounding myself in something physical as I processed what he was saying. And what exactly is that? I asked, because if I was already connected, then I needed to understand the shape of it, not just the edges. His gaze did not waver, but there was a pause again, longer this time, like he was deciding how much of the truth I could hold without it becoming something else entirely. And when he spoke again, it was quieter, more focused. Someone wanted something here to disappear. And the simplicity of that statement carried more weight than anything more detailed could have, because it implied intent, purpose. Something directed. I exhaled slowly, my mind moving through that, connecting it to what I had seen, the uneven burn, the placement, the timing, and I realized that this was not random, not chance, it was designed, and that realization shifted everything. And you think I am part of that now because I noticed, I said, not as a question, but as a way of placing the pieces where they belonged, and he nodded once, a small, precise movement that confirmed it without needing more words. I looked past him again, toward the dark outline of the barn, now reduced to structure and shadow, and for a second I imagined what would have happened if I had not gone back, if I had walked away like everyone else, and the answer came quickly. Nothing would have changed for him, for this situation, for whatever was already moving beneath the surface, but everything would have been different for me, because I would not be standing here now, seen, involved, aware. I turned back to him, my gaze steady. Because if this was real, then I was not going to pretend it was not. So what happens next? I asked, and this time there was no hesitation, no pause, his answer immediate, grounded in that same certainty that defined everything about him. Now we find out why, and the way he said we did not feel accidental, it felt intentional, like he had already decided I was part of that process, and for the first time since this began, I did not push back against it, not because I agreed, but because I understood that this was no longer about avoiding something, it was about facing it with enough awareness to not lose myself inside it. And as I stood there under his gaze, the night settling fully into silence around us, I realized that the fire had not just drawn him here, it had drawn me into something that was not finished, something that was only just beginning, and whether I wanted it or not, I was already standing at the center of it. The way he said it, calm and certain, made it clear this was not a possibility, it was a direction already chosen, and for the first time I did not feel the urge to argue against it, not because I agreed, but because I understood that arguing would not change what was already unfolding. I nodded once, small, deliberate, more to acknowledge the reality than to accept it, and that seemed to be enough for him. Because something in his posture shifted, not relaxed, but settled, like a piece had just locked into place. Then we start with what we know, I said, my voice steady, grounding myself in logic because that was something I could control, and his gaze held mine for a second before he gave a slight nod, not approval, not agreement, something closer to recognition. I turned slightly, looking back toward the barn again, forcing myself to focus on details instead of the weight of the situation. Because details could be understood, broken down, made into something manageable. The fire started unevenly, I continued, more to organize my thoughts than to explain to him. It spread too fast in one direction and too slow in another, and as I spoke, I saw it more clearly, the pattern, the inconsistency, the parts that did not match what a natural fire would do. I stepped a little closer to the edge of the burned structure, careful, aware of the ground beneath my feet, and he moved with me, not guiding, not stopping, just present, his attention as focused as mine. There, I said quietly, pointing toward the darker section I had noticed before, that is where it started, and this time I was certain, not guessing, not assuming, and when I looked back at him, I saw that same certainty reflected in his eyes, not because I had convinced him, but because I had confirmed something he had already believed. One of his men approached again, speaking low, mentioning something about a container found nearby, something that did not belong to the property, and I felt that same unease settle again, sharper now, because this was no longer abstract, it was real, deliberate, planned, Alexander listened without turning, his focus still split between me and the scene, and then he gave a quiet instruction, precise, controlled, and the man moved immediately, disappearing into the shadows with purpose. Someone wanted this to look like an accident, I said. The thought forming as I spoke it, and this time there was no hesitation in his response. Yes, simple, direct, and the confirmation made everything heavier, because it meant intent, not chaos. I crossed my arms again, more out of instinct than defense, feeling the tension settle into something sharper, more focused, but they did not expect someone to notice, I added, and the moment the words left my mouth, I felt his attention shift fully back to me, more intense now, more deliberate, and I understood why. Because that was where I came in, not as a bystander, but as a variable. That had not been accounted for. No, he said quietly, his gaze steady. They did not, and for a second, the silence stretched again, not empty, but charged with understanding, with the realization that this situation had changed because of a single moment, a single choice. I let out a slow breath, the weight of it settling into something clearer now, less overwhelming, more defined. And I realized that fear had shifted into something else, something steadier, something that felt more like resolve. Then whoever did this knows it did not go the way they planned, I said, and this time it was not a question, it was a conclusion, and the way his expression tightened slightly told me I was right. He stepped closer then, just enough to bring his voice lower when he spoke again, more contained, more focused, which means they will adapt, and that word, adapt, carried its own weight, because it meant this was not over, not even close. It meant movement, reaction, escalation. I met his gaze, holding it steady, because if this was going to continue, then I needed to stay grounded in what I knew, not what I feared. Then we need to stay ahead of them, I said, and the moment the words left my mouth, I realized something had shifted again, not just in him, but in me, because I had said we without hesitation, without questioning it, and for a second, I saw it, that same flicker in his eyes, not surprise, not control, something closer to approval, subtle but unmistakable. Yes, he replied, his voice low, certain, and in that single word, I understood that whatever this was, whatever had started here tonight, it was no longer something happening around me, it was something I was already inside, already moving with, and as I stood there beside him, the night quiet, the fire reduced to memory, I realized that the choice I thought I had lost had simply changed form, because now it was not about whether I stayed or left, it was about how I was going to face what came next, and whether I was ready to stand in it without stepping back. The word yes lingered longer than it should have, not because of how he said it, but because of how easily I accepted it, and that realization settled into me with a quiet weight, the kind that does not demand attention but refuses to be ignored, and I stood there for a moment, looking at the space where the fire had been, at the structure that still stood despite everything, and I understood something I had not before. That surviving something does not mean it is over, it just means you are still there when the real part begins. I let out a slow breath, the air cooler now, clearer, and I felt the shift inside me settle into something steady, not fear, not defiance, something closer to resolve, because if I was already in this, then standing still was not going to help me find my way through it. Then we do not wait for them to make the next move, I said, my voice even, grounded in something that felt more certain than anything I had said before, and I saw it again, that brief flicker in his expression, the one that was not surprise, not control, something closer to acknowledgement, like I had stepped fully into the space he had already placed me in. He nodded once, small, precise, and for the first time since this began, it felt less like he was pulling me into something and more like we were standing in the same direction, looking at the same problem. We find the point of origin, he said, his voice low, controlled, but carrying that same certainty that had defined everything about him from the moment he arrived. We trace what does not belong, and the way he said it turned the chaos of the night into something structured, something that could be followed, and I felt my thoughts align with it, not because he led them there, but because it made sense. I glanced back toward the darker section of the barn, the place where everything had started, and for a second I imagined the moment before the fire, the quiet before something changed, and I realized that whoever had done this had believed it would end there, contained, unnoticed, finished, and that was where they had been wrong. They thought no one would question it, I said, more to confirm the pattern than to state the obvious, and he stepped slightly closer. Not enough to close the space completely, just enough to make his presence felt without overwhelming it. They thought no one would see, he corrected quietly, and the difference between those two words settled into me deeper than I expected, because seeing was not the same as questioning. Seeing meant recognizing, understanding, refusing to look away. I met his gaze again, steady now, no hesitation left, because something in me had already crossed that line. Then that is their mistake, I said. And this time there was no doubt in my voice, no uncertainty, just a simple truth that felt more solid than anything else in this night. For a second, the silence stretched again, but it was different now, not uncertain, not shifting, it felt anchored, like something had found its place, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, but carried more weight than anything louder could have. You ran into fire for something fragile, he said, his gaze holding mine in a way that made everything else fade for just a second. Now you stand in something far more dangerous without stepping back, and I felt that settle into me, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a reflection of what had already happened, what I had already chosen without fully understanding it at the time. I did not look away, did not step back, because there was nothing left in me that wanted to retreat from this moment, not when I had already come this far. I do not step back from what is right, I replied, the words quiet but steady, and for the first time, something in his expression shifted in a way that felt almost human, not softer, not weaker, just real, like he recognized something in that answer that mattered beyond this situation. The night settled fully around us then, the last of the smoke fading into the air, the movement slowing as everything that could be done had been done, and I realized that this was the point where everything could have ended, where I could have walked away with a story and nothing more, but instead I stood there, still, present, part of something that had not finished unfolding. He turned slightly.